Hello everybody and welcome to Tier 9 Part 3 of the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. I know it's been a while and I'm so sorry about that. I want to thank you all so much for your patience. But as the channel's been growing and for the month of October, I really wanted to double down on these long sort of one-off horror stories. So I know there wasn't an episode for a month, and I highly appreciate you all being very kind and patient with that. But I hope to not only do this one, but to get the final part out relatively soon, so look forward to that. That being said, as always, I have to carve out a lot of time to research for these videos in particular, because they're always very intensive. But I absolutely love doing this and couldn't imagine doing anything else. Like when it gets to the point I have to use a link from a 4chan thread on the Wayback Machine to find a website talking about demon parasites, I know I've really found my calling. So I'm excited to talk about it, as I'm sure you are to hear about it. But before we get to that, as always, gotta find a way to keep the lights on. So I brought someone on for today's ad. Hello everybody. You may be wondering who this strange man is, and he is going to help us out with the ad today. This video is sponsored by Ridge Wallet, and I've talked about Ridge so many times on this channel. At this point, they pretty much sponsored the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg, and I'm sure that you're getting bored of me talking about it to you all the time. So I bought my dad a Ridge Wallet for himself, so why don't we ask him what he likes about it. So Dad, what do you like about the Ridge Wallet?
Carbon fiber, I really like it, and I really like the money clip on it. Another big thing I like about it is the fact that it's very small, and yet it holds a lot, up to 12 cards. I was really amazed by that. And I'm what you might call one of those baby boomers, and I was very hard to convince, but once I started using it, I don't think I could do without it now. Very good invention.
It's very cool. It's a lot more comfortable than having a huge bulky wallet, especially when it's full of a ton of cards that you never use.
True.
And the fact that it's so small, it has RFID tracking, so digital pickpocketers can't get into your stuff. It has the money clip on the outside. It comes in over 40 different designs and colors. Yes. It is it's the only evolvement of the wallet I've ever seen. True. And it works. True. Like the wallet's been the same for hundreds of years. Yeah. And this is the first improvement on the design in forever.
I'm impressed.
I'm impressed too. Yeah. And you can be impressed too if you go to the link in the description and use discount code Wendigoon. That's right. All you have to do is go to the link in the description, use discount code Wendigoon for 10% off. What's the discount code?
Wendigoon.
And for how much?
10%.
So go to the link in the description and you'll be able to get all that thanks to Ridge Wallet. Thank you all so much for watching the ad. Thank you so much to Ridge for sponsoring the video. It really does mean the most. I hope that you check it out. Any final words?
It's a great wallet. You need to try it.
You need to try it. Thank you all for watching. Thank you, Dad, for being part of the ad. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, son.
And you want to say we're back to the video?
Yes. We're back to the video.
Yeah. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching, and thank you for sticking with me this far into the iceberg and getting me from where I began at the beginning of this year to 780,000 subscribers at the time of recording. I've been blessed beyond belief, and it's thanks to you all. So, sincerely, thank you for watching. Holistic tubes is a specific kind of alternative medicine, specifically a type of alternative medicine that relies on charged metals. Whenever most people think of alt medicine, they think of things like herbal remedies or stretching and meditation. Well, this would be like alt medicine. The idea behind holistic tubes is that the majority of sicknesses or illnesses that people encounter come from a place of negative energy. A lot of this goes back to things I've talked about earlier, like spiritual chakras or energy gathering beings and things like that. While there are different theories on how these tubes are charged, a majority of them say something like magnetized tubes or potentially energy charged tubes, such as a sort of battery. A lot of these I saw had to do with ear infections, so the idea that you could take a metal rod, magnetize it, put it in your ear, and get pain relief. If this were to be true, it would obviously lead to more revelations in science, such as ideas of how energy is determined and what illness truly is. But that belief has several practitioners and users to this day. Cuneiform language and technology is relating back to the idea of cuneiform language, which is essentially a sort of old world written language that relied more on symbols and logos rather than pronunciation and words as we know today. You can think of this as things things like old Mesopotamian text or things like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, while there is a specific type of programming language referred to as cuneiform because it uses symbols very similar to that of cuneiforms, the greater theory behind it comes back to ideas of relearned intelligence. Or in other words, people thousands and thousands of years ago decided the best form of writing was that through symbols and logos, and then sure enough in modern technology there seems to be examples of people relearning what was once known. Now, while the theory partially ends there, and it's just the idea that people continuously relearn whatever the highest order of information is, we can have more fun with it and apply that back into the Great Reset theory, or the idea that humanity works in cycles on the same planet Earth. If that were true, then perhaps the ancient people who wrote the first cuneiforms got their inspiration from the remnants that were left behind by what we would consider a modern society, and then that modern society got it from the previous group of old-time people, and so on and so forth. Essentially creating an almost paradox of information that is passed on from yourself within the previous cycle. Bhutanese shadow market refers to the landlocked country that resides between India and China in the East Himalayas, known as Bhutan. Now, initially, ideas around the Bhutanese shadow market, as it was referred to online, was pretty much your standard ideas of a sort of black market organ trade. And while that would normally be as deep as the theory goes, we're on tier 9, so you know it gets worse. According to those who have interacted with the shadow market, it is not a physical or in-person trade as we would know it, but instead a spiritual storefront. In other words, the only way to access anybody in the shadow market is through meditation and contacting them within a spiritual realm. From there, this supposed shadow market that is operated by Bhutanese monks sells a plethora of forbidden or sacred spiritual goods. And supposedly these goods that they sell are spiritual items such as the life elixir, which can make someone be immortal, human souls trapped within jars, and things like curses in bottles. So essentially, if one reaches a high enough plane of understanding, but wants to have their hands on nefarious items, they could use their plane of understanding to contact one of the monks within the Bhutanese shadow market, and then buy things like human souls and magic capable items off of them. You know, sometimes I say stuff like that, and then I think to myself, like, wouldn't it be funny if someone heard that out of context? But at this point in the iceberg, I think I'd just be committed. Hydrophobia Experiments is essentially another name for rabies experiments. See, rabies was originally known as hydrophobia, at least back whenever Louis Pasteur was developing his vaccine for it. The reason for this being creatures that were infected with rabies and showing symptoms of it had a strong aversion to water. The reason for this is the rabies virus causes such an intense swelling of salivary glands that it makes it hard to swallow. So if a subject tries to swallow water, they begin to choke and throw up. Ironically, the intense salivation and high body temperature makes the patient very, very thirsty, so it's a very tragic and slow way to die. However, as you probably know, rabies is most famous for the deranged nature that it gives to the people who are infected by it. Well, see, that's where these experiments come in. So rabies itself is a form of a single-strand RNA virus. Now, without getting into all the details of what that means, one of the things that it means is that it can mutate very, very easily. To put it in perspective, things like the common cold and the flu are also single-strand RNA viruses, and there's new versions of them several times a year. So the theory is, since this is not only a very scary but a very infectious and mutatable pathogen, there have been countries that have done experiments on rabies in order to make a sort of bioweapon. The reason it's referred to as hydrophobia experiments is because people infected by it, it's not exactly rabies anymore because it's been combined with the flu and syphilis and a bunch of other diseases in order to make this new disease. However, the commonality through all of them is that the patient still experiences hydrophobia, so the disease is just called hydrophobia. But you can absolutely think of it as a zombie plague, because according to the theory, that's exactly what it does. There are supposed logs that exist from Russia within the 1980s and the Cold War, in which Russia kind of had the idea that if anyone decided to destroy them, they would have a sort of dead man switch, that they could give a final middle finger and infect the world with this sort of zombie plague, or in this case, the hydrophobia experiment. Supposedly, the patients within these hydrophobia experiments weren't just out of their head and frothing at the mouth, but they were particularly violent trying to kill not only each other but anyone else who was nearby, after dying 2 to 3 weeks in from dehydration. There are even theories that say during the Iraqi conflict, one of the reasons that there was so much containment measures and countries like the US were so hesitant to leave is because there had been stolen samples of the hydrophobia virus throughout the Middle East. And that one of the reasons world governments were so shady about what their involvement in the Middle East was is because they didn't want to alert worldwide panic by saying we're looking for the zombie plague. Which, to be fair, could be, kind of concerning. Phantom time was a theory proposed by Herbert Illig. Essentially, the main idea behind it is that our modern understanding of history since the death of Christ is largely made up, or at the very least, the timeline is. According to him, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and the Pope of the same time, Sylvester III, put together this sort of idea in order to justify their placement of power. According to the theory, they essentially added several hundred years to history, which conveniently placed them at the year of 1000 AD. Without getting into the politics of it, there was this whole battle over who had the divine right to Europe, and it looked a lot better for Otto and the Pope if they were exactly 1000 years since the death of Christ, because that made them sound really good according to prophecies that were given. However, this did things like make the entire Carolingian, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but the Carolingian period of history completely non-existent, as well as significant figures like Charlemagne would not exist. The idea being that Otto made these characters up within history books as a means of further justifying their placement in history. According to Herbert's theory, specifically the years of 614 AD to 911 AD were made up, or in other words, 297 years of history. His reasons for this are ideas like Gregorian calendar, as it's written, has these gaps in its understanding and seems it was kind of pushed as a means to follow this new narrative, as well as things like Isaac Newton doing the math on the history of eclipses and realizing there's about a 300-year gap in history of when these eclipses took place, and as well as archaeology, since it seems that nearly no large structures were constructed within that 300-year time span, which it would be really weird if no significant empires built anything for 300 years of time and seemingly no new roadways or conquests were made. Again, the idea being that as a means of justifying their placement as rulers over the Holy Roman Empire, these two characters shifted the course of history as we know it forever. Null compliance security is a theory that I've got to be careful with, because all the people involved are still people who are running things and organizations, and I'm not going to go into details because I do not want to be unalived. Yeah. But to give the sort of vague on details version, in 1997 there was an experiment that took place within a Florida prison system. The idea behind this experiment, which took place between the works of several medical schools and drug companies, was to find a long-term sedation for very violent inmates. Supposedly in 1997, this group began giving these specific medications to very violent inmates who were serving life sentences, and after only 40 days, the subject suffered from a permanent sense of total compliance, which is a fancy doctor way of saying that they had their higher cognition and abilities completely stripped from them. This turned what was otherwise violent inmates into essentially vegetative people walking around without really any sense of cognition or understanding. Supposedly this went on for 10 years, and this was conducted on 845 inmates, most of which are still alive and existing within the justice system as sort of mentally ill patients to this day. So essentially the theory is saying that because they can't perform normal lobotomies to shut up people that they're not fond of, they've now found a way to perform chemical lobotomies. Phlogiston theory resurfacing is in reference to a very old world belief of the phlogiston theory. Essentially, the theory said that anything that had the ability to catch on fire and burn contained an element or particle known as phlogiston. The idea being, if you are a creature that is capable of combusting, so I imagine all of us, you are just filled with the particle known as phlogiston. And then after you combust and you're, burnt remains are lying there on the floor, you have now been dephlogistoned. And some things in the natural world, such as water, contain zero phlogiston whatsoever. But as time went on, we learned that fire was essentially a reaction of energy and of supercharged particles and yada yada. However, in recent years, it has been discovered that instead of a different kind of element, there is instead a fourth state of matter known as plasma. So this theory is saying that since we discovered a new state of matter, which has the capability of being what fire itself is, maybe in the future we will discover that there is a sort of trace particle that fire itself uses as a propellant. And then that opens up a whole new door of research. Like, if people are flammable because they got the phlogiston in them or whatever, can we like take it out without, burning them first? Santiago Interference relates to something known as the Santiago theory of cognition. It's a theory of how cognition and life works that was developed by a series of biologists in Santiago, Chile, hence the name. Essentially, this sort of combination between biology and philosophy came to the conclusion that life cannot exist without cognition, and cognition itself cannot exist without life. So if something has both cognition, it must have life, and if something has life, it must have cognition. And consciousness, as we understand it, or the ability to think and be upright and be aware, is more so just cognition, but on a spectrum. And furthermore, these researchers define cognition itself as the ability to react to one's environment. So to kind of lay out what that whole theory is for you, say we have us as people as we exist. We have cognition, or in other words, we have the ability to physically react or understand things that are happening around us. You're watching me talk right now, that information's coming through your ears, your brain is processing it, and you're able to understand the point I'm getting across through language. That is a form of cognition. You are observing things happening in your environment and able to adjust yourself, i.e. your thought pattern, because of it. Now let's take something else that we know to be alive, like a plant. Obviously, plants are alive, but you can't talk to a plant and make it understand you, at least I think that was on the iceberg somewhere, actually. Anyway, for now, we can't talk to plants. However, a plant absolutely does have the ability to react to its environment. Several plants will not only grow into the direction of sunlight, but they do things like reproduce, and some are able to shut off their waterways depending on if it's a dry or wet season. So even though that's not consciousness, as we understand it, according to this definition, that is a form of cognition. So you can think of consciousness as the spectrum, grass being on the low end, us being on the high end, but everything within it having some different form of cognition. So that's the Santiago theory of cognition. So what would Santiago interference be? Well, that relates back to a concept known as cognitive interference. You know how sometimes you'll be sitting there and then you'll just have a really inappropriate or wrong thought run through your head? Like you weren't even thinking about anything in general. You can just be driving your car on the road, and then for some reason a split shot shoots through your brain that tells you to swerve the car off the road. This is a phenomenon known as cognitive interference. There's a lot of theories about why cognitive interference happens, but one of the more commonly accepted ones is that whenever you're not using your brain's cognitive function, it uses that free time as a time to sort of self-check itself. Or in other words, whenever you zone out, your brain has conversations with itself to confirm ideas that it's only suggested. Basically like this. You know, hopefully, that murder is a bad thing to do. However, you probably haven't sat down with yourself and thought like, murder bad, I don't like it. It's just something you generally understand. So because of that, you can be sitting in Pizza Hut and just chilling out, kind of zoned out, your brain vibing. So then your brain's like, hey, why I've got your attention for a second. Are you sure you don't want to kill that guy across from you? No? Okay, making sure. Just don't worry about it. Go back to your pizza. So if your brain uses free moments as a means of checking with itself what is both fears and considers evil, then what would potentially happen if someone had their entire cognitive senses removed? There are theories, although hopefully no experiments that have ever been performed, of what could happen if someone had all of their sensory stimuli removed, or in other words, their sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. Theoretically, they would still maintain motor functions, but be trapped in this sort of shell in which they can't understand anything about their environment. So in this time of free total cognition, if we know the brain to give short spurts of evil and wrong whenever it has a chance, What happens if it can give really, really long spurts of it? And again, according to the Santiago theory of cognition, something cannot be alive without having cognition and understanding its environment. So in this state of between life and death, is that where a sort of purgatory resides, in which someone's mind gives them all these evil ideas and entraps them to within themselves? Santiago Interference essentially asks the question, if something cannot be alive without being cognitive, then what is a living thing without that cognition? Eilean Mor Island is something that I covered in great detail in my Ocean Mysteries video, link in the description. But to give a short version here, in the year 1900 there were 3 lighthouse keepers who were set to run the Eilean Mor Island lighthouse. However, while they were there, a heavy fog set in around the lighthouse. So heavy, in fact, the relief keepers were stalled a week from sailing out to the island. By the time they did eventually get there, the entire 3-man crew was missing. And by missing, I mean they totally vanished. There was still food set out on their table, all of the doors were shut, the beds were unmade. It's like they were going about their daily lives and just disappeared. However, what's most interesting about the story is the second mate's logbook of what events had occurred. In the logbook, he said that they experienced storms so turbulent and powerful that it caused these 3 lifelong sailors to come together and pray and cry. Before the final entry simply said, "Storm has stopped, God is over all," and then again, they were never seen. Now what's interesting is Eilean Mor isn't far from the shores of mainland Scotland, and there were no storms reported within that time period. As a matter of fact, ships were going about their daily schedule. So these supposedly very centered storms that didn't affect anyone outside of them, and the heavy fog on the area, has led theorists to believe that perhaps the Eilean Mor Island lighthouse crew was experiencing a sort of dimensional rift. Or if things like dimensions can be torn into, perhaps the fogs was a show of them crossing over or something crossing over into their realm. And even if unwanted, this complete vanishing of the Eilean Mor Island lighthouse crew could be a sign of dimensional travel, or a sort of short-term purgatory imposed on them for some reason. I should also mention that this entire story was the inspiration for the Robert Edgars movie The Lighthouse, so do with that information what you will. Sphinx water erosion hypothesis implications is an implication that the Sphinx is way, way older than we believe it to be. See, the generally taught version of history is that the Sphinx was built about 4,500 years ago. The reason for this is the earliest dated time in which Egyptians settled the land, so it makes sense that the Sphinx was built around that time. However, there are 2 main hangups with that theory. For one, the Sphinx is very, very sand and wind eroded compared to structures around it. Like, sure, the pyramids aren't in perfect condition, but the Sphinx is to a point that the nose is completely missing, and it seems to have been there for a much longer time. The second and more damning fact is that in the pit around the Sphinx and within the Sphinx itself, there is a form of heavy water erosion. Or essentially, these lines that have ran through the stone are from some form of water that has poured over it. The issue with that being, that area of Egypt has not experienced significant rainfall to the point of causing any flooding in about 9,000 years. Because of this, that would mean that the Sphinx was there twice as long as we currently believe it to be. And you may be asking, what's the big deal with that? Well, the Egyptians are one of the first recorded civilizations that existed at least outside of the immediate Middle East, or on the fringe of the Middle East, one of the first civilizations moving into Africa. So if they existed 4,500 years before when we believe them to have currently existed, that messes up all the timelines. That would give ideas like religion more footholds in how they describe humanity departing and settling regions. And essentially, if you were to add 4,500 years to modern society's clock, then a lot more could have happened and a lot more things make sense than current science and theories say they do. Are quantic genetic engineered entities? Oh boy. So I talked about archons way back in the Iceberg, and I mentioned them as being essentially the demons within the religion of Gnosticism. And I don't really know anyone who's like a modern Gnostic, but just in case you're out there, I don't think they all believe in this. I think just a few of them, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So essentially the idea is there is a system within people called the gallbladder meridian. It starts in your ears and then connects in the middle of your brain, and runs down your body and does some zigzags and eventually comes out on your fourth toe. The idea being this is the mainline control center for your body. So these archons within Gnosticism, these demons, have developed these parasites that essentially look like jellyfish that they implant in people through their ears. The jellyfish go to their gallbladder meridian and then start out slow by suggesting things to people like, hey, we should lay back on talking to family members and we should become more reserved. And it essentially starts as sort of a voice in your back of your head, but then it starts to control little tiny muscle movements and eventually gets to the point where it just takes over the human host. The purpose of this is for the archons to one day develop a sort of zombie army through the use of these jellyfish parasites. And in reading this, there was a group of people known as the Star People who during the Orion Wars learned how to reach into someone's gallbladder meridian and pull out the demon parasite to keep them from being a part of the zombie army. I try to make jokes about some of it, but I just can't. We're moving on. Gnosticism be wild, and man, I'll tell you what. Ulfma is interesting. So I cannot find what the word Ulfma itself means. I believe it's an acronym since every letter is capitalized. However, if you search it on an alternate search site that isn't something like Google or Bing, you come to a search result for this book about theosophy on the Amazon bookstore. The book was written by a man named Rudolf Steiner, who was one of the earliest proponents of theosophy. Theosophy is essentially the idea that there is one hidden truth within the world, and once that one truth is understood, it can be manipulated. And furthermore, there is a group of these sort of reality hackers who have figured out what the one truth is, and they are known within theosophy as the Masters. Supposedly, these Masters exist as prominent figures throughout history who have manipulated their place within history because they understand how the universe works. So they can perform things like magic and witchcraft and stuff that we would consider unexplainable, but is actually all logical because they just understand how things go together. So that's the core idea of theosophy itself. It's really interesting that whatever Ulfma means, it for some reason brings you to a book by one of their founders. And if you go through the book reviews on that book on the Amazon store, there are several people mentioning how theosophy is so great and how they better now understand the root of the Masters and all this wild stuff. It's fantastic. Eggless Travel refers to a theory that probably deserves its own video from the 1980s known as Ong's Hat. Ong's Hat is a sort of abandoned town in New Jersey that was supposedly the place for this conspiracy theory. This is one of the oldest online stories on the internet, starting all the way back in the 80s on internet bulletin boards. According to the stories, a group of Princeton professors had done enough experimentation with things like quantum mechanics to develop a way to perform a form of dimension travel, or in other words, teleportation and potentially time travel. They did this with something known as the egg, which was essentially a device that they described made them capable of moving through dimensions. However, there were theories within this that said if they got to a point where they no longer needed the egg to travel, they could seemingly just time and reality hop at will with no issues. So all those pictures you see that supposedly looks like someone wearing modern day clothes back in like the 1950s, or someone with a cell phone during like the Civil War, the idea behind it is that these Princeton professors eventually developed a form of eggless travel and are now simply just messing with the timeline and hopping around and causing problems wherever. So good for them. Prolepsis is a concept within literary works, and if someone is an English or literature major and wants to call me out for it, that's fine, but I promise I try. Essentially, prolepsis is describing an event or alluding to an event before the event itself actually happens. In literature, this is phrases like he was a dead man when he came through the door, which implies and tells us that that character is going to die. However, he's not dead yet, it's just alluding to it. So apply that concept to history and humanity. There are several instances of this quote-unquote foreshadowing existing in history. Everything from religions describing what nations would rise and fall and who would take over, to things like art that's only recently been discovered being very similar to modern art. Now this implies one of two things. It implies that there are inevitable conclusions that every society will reach, or in other words, it's like two separate experiments happening in two different points in time and they each come to the same end result. Or you can have the really fun theory of the grand cycle that I love to talk about, and the idea that at some point someone started a trend, and then it's just constantly being relearned and rediscovered by every society afterwards. This creates a sort of chicken and egg paradox, because there's no way of telling where it would have began if that was the case, but it's wild to think that modern people inventing stuff that was inspired by ancient works was inspired by modern people the last time through the cycle. Stonehead of Guatemala is referencing this image that was taken in the 1950s within Guatemala. For whatever reason, in the middle of a completely uninhabited area of the Guatemalan jungle, there is this giant statue of a head. The artwork does not match any of local or known societies' artworks of what faces or statues looked like. And furthermore, after the researchers went back to their home country, there was this big political war that took place in Guatemala, and whenever they came back years later, they couldn't find where it was. And since that's all the information we have on it, this is a giant that shot out of hollow earth, like it was down there, and it heard there were researchers, so it just like shot itself, or a statue of itself, out of the hollow earth, and then they took this picture, and then you thought it'd be really funny to hide it again. And that's what happened, and guess what? You can't prove me wrong, so we're just going to move on. The phone mafia is the idea that the majority of scam callers, as we know them to be, are actually part of a much larger and more grand body. Essentially, you know all those phone scams you get, things like the Nigerian prince, or the police saying you need to pay a speeding ticket, or cases saying that you have a relative who needs bailed out, etc. Well, we understand those to each be just one-off callers trying to make a quick buck. However, the idea is there is a much, much larger crime syndicate who just works through middleman as a means of getting money this way. Or in other words, they send an agent to hire a middleman to make the call, and if the middleman's ever caught, then he doesn't even know how to report to the police the people who got him to do it. If they are this expansive, then it would be global, and it would have to be an incredibly large organization. And people have made the relatively fair point of, if gangs and things like the mafia were such a huge deal for hundreds of years, and then they just kind of disappeared, who's to say they didn't go into things like cyber or electronic theft? I also want to mention there's been a number of journalists and police officers who have investigated this, who have been found not alive. So to cover my bases on this, these are all jokes. Everything I'm saying is a joke. This YouTube channel is a joke. I'm a joke. Nothing that I'm saying is worth unaliving over, and this is to my audience. If for whatever reason in the future news comes out that I committed exit game, no, I didn't. Approaching stars is the opposite of the expanding universe theory. So you know the idea that there is a big bang or some event that happened that created the universe, and because of that everything's kind of drifting apart from one unified center? Well, this idea is saying that perhaps that center developed its own gravitational pull and became a really big black hole, because now everything is coming back to where it started. Because of this, things like stars and meteorites and everything else is slowly getting confined to a much smaller space, which means before we're wiped out by our sun getting big and exploding, we'll probably get hit by a meteor or run into another solar system, so don't worry about it. Loveshack is an operating system that supposedly contains the grand truth of the universe. Now, I'm an idiot when it comes to reading things like computer operating systems, but from the best that I can make out, the idea is within the code of the Loveshack operating system is this grand truth, or essentially the one middle concept that all forms of human expression in science can be defined by. So supposedly, if you were to go within the operating system and enter something like a chemical equation, it will then convert that into calculus, it will convert that into forms of poetry, it can convert that into spiritualism and whatever. Essentially, this is supposedly a super duper top secret OS that allows people to discover the hidden truths within the universe because of its own hidden secret code. Retrocausality is something that I've mentioned before in the past, but it's going to get more attention here. The main idea being that things like cause and effect do not operate the way that we think it does. Instead, things simply happen and the universe corrects itself as a means of maintaining that end goal. It essentially comes down to the idea that there isn't really that much agency when it comes to what happens in the future, and instead things happen and therefore people align to it. And the reason it gives for this is the idea that time itself exists as a dimension. And you've probably heard that before, but what it really means is that time is just our way of observing the universe. However, it's something that can be manipulated and we could definitely change. We just don't know how to yet, so while we view everything that happens to us as being on a straight track, in reality things just kind of happen and there's not really a timeline to it. This has also been used as a means of explaining the Mandela effect. For example, things like the Monopoly Man. Most people, when they think of the Monopoly Man, think of him as having a monocle, even though he never did. So the idea is that we saw him at one point with a monocle. That's our memory of him. However, at some point in the future, he did not have a monocle, and for whatever reason, the timeline just favored that one and corrected itself. So now every iteration of him does not have the monocle. So whenever you apply that to larger scale things like human civilizations, wars, kingships, and what have you, you can theoretically get to a point, if someone were to understand this and to understand how retrocausality works, where there would be no unknown future. Or in other words, if things in our future are going to take place, and if time is just a construct that we've built for ourselves, then there should be ways to determine what is about to happen to us, because in terms of retrocausality, it's already happened. And not only things like predicting the future, but it can get to things like time travel, things like dimensional travel, and all that other cool stuff. Vaccine soul stealing is, let me clarify, because YouTube really likes to demonetize people who say the V word, especially in a video that has conspiracy theory in the title. As you're going to find out, it has nothing to do with modern political climates or modern political issues. As a matter of fact, this chart was made like 5 years ago, so again, nothing to do with that. And it isn't even saying something about all vaccines being bad, just one specific theory. I'm begging you, Susan, please do not take my money. Essentially, the idea is that in the early 2000s, the CIA got really interested in the concept of gene editing. Now, this is something from the MK experiments and other theories that I've mentioned on this iceberg that the CIA is definitely not opposed to doing. However, in this case, the CIA was interested in something known as the fundamentalist gene. The idea behind the fundamentalist gene is that it's a gene or actual section of the human brain that allows people to have a belief or calling to a higher power. In other words, there's parts of the brain that light up more with people who believe in things like religion and God as opposed to people who do not. So during the war in the Middle East, the CIA wanted to know if there was a way to sort of chemically castrate this. And supposedly, as the theory states, the CIA developed these vaccines that they handed out overseas in populations that they think may fall in line to a radicalization that is not in their favor. Or in other words, the CIA gave out medication to people that, unbeknownst to them, would cause them to lose their ability or focus on God and things relating to a higher power, as a means of making sure that they didn't fear any higher authority than the United States government. But I mean, I think at this point, we can all agree that this is stupid and didn't happen. Like, come on guys, we know the reason that the United States was in the Middle East was to get the zombie plague back from the Russian scientists. Like, it's really not that hard. But on that note, that is the end of Tier 9 of the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. And as always, thank you for watching. Personally, I'm thinking that this iceberg has just got better as it's gone on. And I love the fact that it went from just sort of these overarching or large ideas within, culture and conspiracy things or well-known things that everyone knew, like Big Pharma. And it eventually got to like, yeah, there's a set of experiments of zombie plagues and things like that crazy out of, which speaking of, in the beginning, whenever I mentioned having to use the Wayback Machine to find this website, that was the whole Archon ear implanted parasite thing. It was from a website called like Galaxy Connections, which I've considered doing videos on stuff like that, but it's so much to set down and like the first sentence be like, so this was during the 8th year of the Orion Wars when the Star People were fighting the Archons. It's like, it's a lot to take in at once. I still may do a video about it in the future, but it would definitely take time to understand any of what's being said, because I need like a thesaurus for every sentence. But that was Tier 9. I hope that you enjoyed. If I seem a little tired or like sloppy voiced right now, it's because, for one, it's 4 in the morning, but also I have now recorded this 3 times in a row. I got halfway through, I got all the way through, like I did this entire video, this take and all of it, and then I look at my camera and it quit recording about halfway through when I was talking about Santiago Interference. And then I was like, okay, so I record the second half again, and then I go look at my camera and it quit recording at the Sphinx one. So I've done this outro 3 times now, which, oh boy, I'm tired. But I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't juxtaposition. I always worry when something like that happens, it's going to go from me being like perky and happy to like depressed and bitter. And I hope that didn't come through any. I also want to say thank you all so much for watching here, and thank you so much for your patience, as I mentioned earlier. I know that the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg is probably, or at least hopefully, something that you all want to see more of and to see it as quickly as possible. But not a lot of people will click on Tier 9 Part 3, which, if you did, good for you. Happy that you're here. But most people won't do that. So I really appreciate that during a time like Halloween, I was able to grow and expand by just doing like these sorts of things I'm still interested in, of course, but not series, just like one-off long videos about different spooky context or content, and I really enjoyed doing it. It was fun, and thank you all so much for allowing me to do that. That being said, I will be finishing up the serial killer iceberg soon, and then we're going to finish out the conspiracy theory iceberg pretty soon as well. There is, I'll go ahead and preface this now, and if I'm proved wrong in the future, it's dumb. I still think Tier 10 is going to be one video for the whole thing. However, there's one term on there that I think is its own list. Like, there's one term at the end, and I could be wrong about this, but I think it takes you to like a list of 40 other terms. And if that's the case, like, this next video is still going to be the end. It's still going to be the finale, the part 10. And then I'll do its own video for those. But if that's, I could be wrong, and just, you can come back and let me know that I'm stupid from the future to me in the past right now. But I think that's where it's going, and if it does, that'll be its own thing. But it should be one more video to close out the Conspiracy Theory Iceberg series. I hope that wasn't too confusing. But thank you for watching. Thank you all for pushing me to 780,000 subscribers. I can't believe it. That's beyond anything I could imagine. I'm blessed beyond belief, and it's thanks to you guys. Speaking of blessings, thank you so much to these people over here. Thank you to all of my patrons and my top tier patrons that you can see here. You guys support me. You guys keep me going. You're the reason this channel's happening, and it means the most. And now that I'm able to like take off and do stuff like this full time, I'm able to crank out more. I'm able to commit more time and dedication to it. And again, it's thanks to you guys. It's thanks to you all watching, and it's fantastic, and it really does mean the most. So thank you. I believe that should do it. There's the conspiracy. I'm so tired right now. There's the 2 icebergs I've got to finish, and I believe that should be it. I've got a couple more creepy like one-off concepts coming up in the future, but you'll see those when you get them. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!